So last weekend I got to test hands-on with the newly announced Canon C400 cinema camera. This is their newest 6K full-frame cinema camera, and it's really their first modular cinema camera that they've released. So if you're new to the channel or any of my content, I tour with a country artist named Luke Combs, and we were in Los Angeles, California last weekend doing 2 nights at SoFi Stadium. My friend James, who works at Canon, has a C400 unit with him currently, and he was in town and was kind enough to bring it to us so that we could just play around with it before the show started. Now let me get this out of the way right now. This is not a camera footage test video. I'm not going to be using any of the test footage from this camera. This is just my impressions on the camera, my experience using it, and some of the practical things about this camera that I liked. So I've been shooting on the C70 since about 2021, and this is one of my favorite cameras I've ever owned. About 1/3 of the year, I'm typically doing work in music, whether it's touring or music festivals. And the other portion of the year, I'm doing other work as a camera operator or cinematographer, whether that's documentary, run and gun shooting, or larger scale commercial productions. Anytime I'm on a production where I'm not using Red or Arri, I'm pretty much always bringing the C70 along. This camera has handled pretty much every production and obstacle that I've thrown at it. However, there are some limitations to it, and that's kind of where the C400 piqued my interest. Just to summarize some of the key specs that are in the C400, you have a 6K full frame CMOS backlit sensor, which now has a triple base ISO. And triple base ISO essentially means there are three different ISOs, 800, 3200, and 12800 that you can switch to and still retain all of the information and the most dynamic range out of the camera. So you're still getting the most out of that sensor at those base ISO levels. You can shoot 6K up to 60 frames a second in RAW 12-bit, and they also expanded that and give you more compression options with their Canon RAW, which is nice. I shoot Canon RAW quite a bit on the C70, and this just gives me more options for that. And then when you switch to 10-bit, it downscales that 6K image to 4K, and you can shoot up to 120 frames a second. Then you can also crop the sensor into a Super 16 to shoot 180 frames a second. Think of it as if you're familiar with shooting on Red. Every time you drop resolutions, it windows the sensor. That's kind of what it's like to go from full frame, Super 35, and then Super 16 to shoot those other options. That's obviously a very surface level explanation of the specs that are in this camera, but what's more important to me initially is what are the features in this camera, what are the practical uses that this camera is going to improve on from the C70. So the initial thing that I really wanted to check out and was curious about was the size and form factor of it. This being their first modular camera, there's a lot of big shoes to fill in this industry because we're kind of in this world of modular cinema cameras as a whole, and now they're tapping into this market that has already existed for so long. And I was very curious to see how it was going to stack up. The size of it is a little bit bigger than the C70, so it's obviously a box, so it's going to be deeper than the C70, maybe a little bit taller, but overall the build of it is different. The C70 is more of a hybrid camera. It's built like a thick 1DX or like a larger mirrorless camera. This is just a box. This is a boxed cinema camera. The size allows you to put it on a Ronin really with no issue. We tried it with a 24-70 and then we tried it with a 70-200. It feels like it's big and like it's not going to balance on the Ronin, but people also think that the C70 is too big to balance on a Ronin, and that's just not the case. It was able to balance with no issues. We did have to throw the monitor on the side because this camera does not have a built-in monitor, so you do have to have a monitor with it, and we just put it onto the side where the NATO adapter on the Ronin is, and we could just run it right there, and it was pretty convenient. Now, if I'm running a Ronin in like a really quick run and gun way, and I don't necessarily need to be shooting on a camera like the C400, I'm always going to go for a mirrorless camera or the C70, something that has a small screen built in, just for the convenience of being able to pick it up, grab a shot, or whatever. But if I am running a project where it is just necessary to have a larger rig, I don't mind having a monitor off to the side. And since this monitor is pretty small, it didn't feel like I had a big 5 or 7-inch monitor off to the side of the Ronin, which I pretty much never use because that just gets a little bulky and annoying at that point. Now we did have to use the smaller BPA 30 Canon batteries for it to fit, otherwise the BPA 60s would not clear the back where the gimbal arm is. But that's not really a big issue because we had like I would say at least an hour and 20 minutes of battery life from that small battery, which is very impressive. And obviously that's a thing with the Canon cinema line, is their battery life is incredible, and that's one of the reasons why I enjoy shooting on the C70. Let's talk about the autofocus on it. Now, when you're in the world of cinema cameras, you're not necessarily always using autofocus, but there are plenty of situations where autofocus still makes sense. And with this camera having the new backlit sensor, it gives you improved autofocus. And whenever I was testing it, I had to adjust the settings around to really get it dialed in to where it made sense with the autofocus speeds and everything. But once I got it set, I felt like it was really nice and it worked well. I didn't have a chance to test it in low light situations, and that's where the C70 kind of starts to fall apart with autofocus. But just the short amount of testing that I had with it, I was very impressed with the responsiveness of it and, the ability to dial in the speeds and just the way the autofocus reacts. It felt really nice and natural. If you're familiar at all with the C100 or the C200, that's kind of the feel I was getting whenever I built it up for handheld. The actual form factor of it feels much like the C300 and the C500. It's very well balanced, it feels solid, the top handle is really nice quality, and it also is a 3-point attachment on the top so that thing's not going anywhere. But it still is light enough to where it feels like the C100 and the C200. Everything else from a practical shooting standpoint is very similar to the other Canon cinema line, so you're not really getting anything different there when it comes to the buttons and the custom function settings and everything that you can use with this camera. But I felt very comfortable right away shooting with it just because I'm familiar with that stuff already. Another big thing that for me is important in a camera is the input and outputs. So with the C70 obviously being, let's call it an entry-level cinema camera, you only have a single output. It's one HDMI out, and you can send that feed out to whatever you need, a client monitor, a director's monitor, but you can't send a clean feed out unless you get rid of all of the UI in your camera, so now you don't have those tools. So that's what I really like about the C400 is that you're getting all of those inputs and outputs that the C300 and the C500 have, but in a smaller form factor. So now we have USB-C, you have a monitor SDI, you have an SDI out, and then you have an HDMI out. So there are options to send that clean feed out to a Teradek and then send that out to your monitors. And that might not be an important feature for everybody's use, but for me, that is huge. So who is this camera for, and is it a replacement for the C70? I think it's important to note here that this camera is much different than a C70. I don't think it should be directly compared to the C70 because it definitely fits more into the world of the C300 and the C500. I do think Canon did a really good job at bridging the gap so that you are getting the benefits of a smaller camera, but also getting all of the features of those larger cameras. But I don't think this camera necessarily is something that would replace a C70 for most people. I think each camera system fits the mold for different types of productions, and I think that the C400 is just going to fit the mold a little bit better than my C70 did. I think what Canon was doing with this camera is putting something into the market that can directly compete with the other modular cinema cameras under $10,000. And the fact that they're giving us a 6K full frame sensor that shoots RAW for $8,000 is pretty impressive. That price point right there is kind of that perfect in between for someone who's getting into the cinema camera world but doesn't want to spend $15,000 or $20,000. And you're getting so much from a camera within that price point, in my opinion. Now, of course, there's going to be things that I don't like about this camera. I just didn't have enough time to see those things yet. So down the road, whenever this camera releases to the public and I'm able to do a long-term review, yeah, there's going to be things that I don't like about it. The same with the C70. There's tons of things I don't like about it. So that kind of wraps up my initial impressions of this camera. I didn't have a ton of time to shoot with it. I only had a couple hours, so I really wanted to just test out the practical features of this camera. I wasn't necessarily worried about image quality because I know to an extent what image quality is going to look like in all of these cameras. So I hope you found this video helpful. We obviously have a ton of time before this camera is released to the public, so there's going to be a lot more of these videos coming out on YouTube to kind of help you figure out if this camera is perfect for your needs or not. But that's going to be it for today. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit me up in the comments and tell me your thoughts on this camera, whether you like it or hate it. I'll see you all in the next video.